So without further ado, we're going to invite our panelists to the stage, and I'm going to give a brief bio, and then you'll hear a lot more about their work over the course of our conversation. But first up, Sierra Hinton. Sierra is the former executive director and publisher of Scalawag, and she's a co-founder of the Lorde Society, which we'll hear more about. Sierra is also the development director at Blue Engine, a collaborative that works with media companies, startups, foundations, and others on revenue and audience growth, product development, consumer user experience, and digital strategy. And prior to her work in journalism, Sierra was an individual giving officer at a number of education nonprofits, most recently Teach for America, DC. And Sierra calls North Carolina home. She lives in Durham and is a graduate of the UNC Chapel Hill, like her mother before her. Welcome, Sierra. Okay. I love being handled. Next up is Lauren Willams. Lauren is the co-founder and CEO of Capital B, an award-winning nonprofit local national news organization serving Black audiences that launched in January 2022. Before starting Capital B, Lauren was senior vice president and editor-in-chief of Vox, where she managed editorial and business operations. Lauren previously served as executive editor and managing editor at Vox, and has also been an editor at Mother Jones and deputy editor at The Root. Lauren serves on the boards of directors of the International Women's Media Foundation, the Online News Association, and the Associated Press Foundation for Journalism. Welcome, Lauren. And last but definitely not least is Jonquilyn Hill. And Jonquilyn she hosts Explain It to Me, your hotline for all your unanswered questions. She joined Vox, it's a part of Vox. She joined Vox in 2022 as a senior producer and then as host of The Weeds, Vox's policy podcast. Before joining Vox, she was a senior producer for WAMU and NPR's 1A, where she helped launch the show and oversaw the team that adapted the broadcast into a daily podcast. While at WAMU, she also created and hosted Through the Cracks, which is phenomenal. If you guys haven't listened to it, you should. A podcast that examined the systems in place that led to the disappearance of 8-year-old Relisha Rudd from a Washington, D.C. homeless shelter. She previously worked at NPR, NY1, and NBC's Washington Bureau. Welcome, Jonquilyn. All right. So I'm going to transition over here. Sounds like the mic is still working. So I wanted, I gave these bios, and we're going to get into why we chose to center this first kickoff conversation around Black women. And but first, before we dive into that, I want each of you to just give a little bit of background of, your journey to starting the Lorde, co-founding the Lorde Society, starting Capital B, and your work at Vox, and Explain It to Me. So we'll start with you, Sierra, because I want you to just talk a little bit about why you co-founded the Lorde Society, who Audre Lorde was, and what your hopes are and what you've learned about the role of Black women in this moment.
Yeah. Hey everyone, very excited to be here. So great to see y'all. So as Sarah mentioned, I was the executive director publisher of Scalawag, which is an abolitionist media organization based in the South. And I like to say that I was an accidental publisher. Like, I didn't go to journalism school. At no point was I like, yeah, let me run a newsroom. But it happened, and I had a huge learning curve. I had a lot that I had to figure out, but I was also very fortunate that there were other Black women, Candace Fortman at Outlier, Wendy at MLK 50, Jaquanda at Flint Beat, meeting Sarah, who were around me trying to figure out the same things, like how do we run these news organizations, how do we grow them, how do we sustain them? And so it really felt like we had this sort of informal network happening of support for each other. And eventually we got to the point where some of us said, hey, what does it look like for us to formalize this a bit more, to spend more time together, to be more intentional about creating a network of support? And so that's how the Lorde Society was started. And that's something that we've been doing for a few years now, and really thinking about how do we make that more formalized, especially as many of us transition out of our roles and new folks come into leadership, making sure that they have that same sort of network of support and also network of safety that we had. So that's really how we got started. But I think what's really critical about the work that we were able to do individually and together is like a lot of us have stories of folks didn't really think we were going to mess around and do what we were able to do. I don't think that when I came into leadership at Scalawag, folks are going to be like, yeah, Scalawag is going to be a model for how we practice just journalism in this industry. But that's like exactly what happened. And so, I think being able to say like, no, we're not, generally Black women are not the leaders that folks look to build the models. And yet we consistently do it and we do it well. We're not just leaders in community engagement or reaching audiences that other newsrooms swear they cannot reach. We're also leaders in building revenue models and building products that folks love and enjoy. And so I think it is really critical for folks to have that awareness and really be looking to us as the leaders that we are.
And just say a word or two about Audre Lorde.
Oh, yeah. So for those who don't know, Audre Lorde was an organizer and a poet and a writer and a radical queer feminist. And I think, the reason that we settled on naming the network the Lorde Society is because Audre Lorde has a really famous quote that I'm sure many of you have heard: the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so for us, understanding, like, working within journalism, we were not going to be able to use the same tools that white-led newsrooms have built and used to be able to change journalism. We were going to need to do something different, especially if that change was going to result in the communities that we serve and love and are a part of actually being able to have access in the ways that we haven't previously. So that is.
And I definitely want to get into like what are those new tools later, because there's going to be a lot of dismantling that has to happen.
That's real.
And we definitely need some new tools. So Lauren, you and Akoto Afori-Ada, two Black women, co-founded and started Capital B in 2022. What was the impetus for that? And I'm just curious, like 2 years later, how has that journey shifted, or is it straight ahead, what you envisioned?
Yeah, so Akoto and I met in 2010, and we both worked at The Root. And so we sort of forged our working relationship in startup, it was a startup at the time, in startup Black media, and stayed friends, stayed connected even as we left and went our separate ways. And in 2020, Akoto was the managing editor of The Trace, which is a nonprofit news organization that focuses on gun violence in America. And I was the editor of Vox. And 2020, as we recall, was, you may have blocked it out, but it was quite a time. And it was a time for our country, but generally with COVID, with the election, but very specifically the things that were happening with COVID, with the election, with the murder of George Floyd, were directly impacting Black communities around the country. And at the same time, there was a reckoning happening in mainstream newsrooms where Black journalists were saying, we have not been listened to. We have been told that our lived experiences make us biased in covering stories that are about our communities. And all of these things were happening at once. Also, we're under lockdown. And it really started to make me and Akoto think about the importance of serving audience. You know, there's a time, at this time, people can do pretty good stories on what's happening in Black communities. But who's it for? And what do Black communities need in these moments more than ever is high quality news and information. And so we both said to ourselves, like, if everything's going to be this hard, if work's going to be this hard, if life is going to be this hard, if journalism is this complicated, we need to be doing this work, putting our blood, sweat, and tears toward increasing news for our communities. And so we both stepped away from our jobs and launched Capital B, which is a local and national news organization. We have a national newsroom that covers issues that affect Black people across the country. We now have 2 local newsrooms, one in Atlanta and one in Gary. And our mission is to just create more for Black communities.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we'll get into that more. And Jonquilyn Hill, you know, you are an amazing talent. Which I don't know if you would consider yourself a podcaster. Do you?
Oh, I consider myself a podcaster.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
It's a loaded term now.
Right, exactly. I didn't want to, you
Yes.
know, I don't want to assume. But, you know, like the work that you've created, though, has broken through in this very kind of white male-dominated space. And we saw, like, the Joe Rogan. We know how powerful and influential these podcasts, when they take root, can be. And so I'm curious, you know, tell us a little bit, as a Black woman and a podcaster in this space, how have you been able to differentiate yourself and really cultivate audience that resonates and that's growing?
I think, so one of my favorite things about the audio medium is its intimacy. You know, I think it is the oldest way that we have shared information, not necessarily, you know, on our phones, on these podcatchers, but I just imagine, you know, even back in our caveman days, we were surrounded by the fire, and there was probably someone who knew all the cave gossip and the goings on, and they were the person sharing. Or I think of that African tradition of the griot, and I think that podcasting is sort of just the latest in doing that. And what I think makes my work stand out, makes the work of different people stand out, is the fact that so much of podcasting is actually about personality. I think that's where it differs a little from traditional terrestrial radio. Our media landscape is fractured more than ever, so it's really about leaning into the audience you want and really developing a relationship with them. And I think podcasting is able to do that in a very particularly special way. I think especially the show I'm working on now, Explain It to Me, you know, you have listeners calling in, you begin to develop a relationship with your listeners, and you know, it's this active conversation. And you know, we see these white guys on their couches with their microphones getting these multi-million-dollar deals. Yes, and you know, it can be frustrating seeing the resources go to those places, especially when you're a person who's concerned about craft and audience and facts. But I think
Imagine that.
but I think the plus side is, even if you don't have, you know, if you're not #1 on the iTunes charts, and if you're not getting these multi-million-dollar deals, you're still developing this really close relationship with your audience. There was, I think it was by Acast, maybe last year, that podcasters are some of the most trusted people in media right now. It's one of the few places where there's still that trust in media, and that's something that I do not take lightly. So I think, okay, if I have audience, if I've built this trust, how do I develop that relationship with them? And it really comes down to being yourself. You know, I'm not a white guy. I don't know if you all know this, but I'm not a white man. And I lean in, not into just my identity, but my own interest, my own lived experiences. And I think that can really help you stand out in such a crowded market.
Yeah. And, you know, I've been in radio, and it's Black talk radio. So when you talk about that interactivity and that trust and cultivating those audiences, I mean, I think that the thing that I say about radio, which applies to podcast and audio, is that there's an intimacy and an anonymity at the same time. And that's something that that particular platform, I think, really cultivates, and that also engenders trust. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing in that space. So, you know, we titled this panel, Listen to Black Women. And the subtext or the foundation of these conversations is all about the 2024 presidential election, what we learned. And, you know, it is undeniable that Black women showed up in a very powerful way in this particular election cycle, because we had our first Black woman, Black and South Asian woman, as the Democratic nominee. And I don't know if everybody remembers, but when President Biden had that terrible debate performance, the calls for him to step down happened almost immediately, and there were a laundry list of white men, basically, who were being thought to be the appropriate standard bearer. Kamala Harris wasn't really being talked about that much. And then when she did get the nod, the win with Black women, there was this groundswell immediately. And I think Capital B wrote a piece that said 44,000 Black women raised $1.4 million for Kamala Harris in like one day. And so, and the fact that Black women played such a pivotal role, and it demonstrated that Black women have always been kind of the backbone of the Democratic Party. And then we have the outcome of the election, and I want to know, and I want each of you to answer this, like, the uptick of support for Donald Trump among all demographics except Black women. 92% of Black women voted for Donald Trump. Black men, Latino men, Asian Americans, white women, like, what does this kind of broad uptick of support for Donald Trump in, against someone who is so wildly qualified, what does that say to you, and what did it reveal in your reporting? Like, what did your reporting tell us? What happened with all of those demographics, except Black women, for that outcome to happen across the board? Who wants to take a stab at that? Go ahead, Lauren.
I'll start. So I would be hesitant of any sweeping conclusions at this point about what actually happened in the election. But I do remember when Kamala Harris became the nominee, it was sort of a controversial topic, and I understand why, because the way that the question was being framed was framed in problematic ways, but people didn't really want to talk about the implications of a Black woman being the nominee. And I still think that people don't want to talk about the implications of a Black woman being the nominee. Like, if you look at any pundit, give their laundry list of reasons why she lost, they never want to give that one.
You mean like racism and sexism?
Yes. Mm-hmm. They never want to give that one. And maybe it's never going to shake out that we have that very clear answer. But I think Black women have an idea that had something to do with it. And I think in an environment where there is racism and sexism across the board in our country, and also a lot of people are angry about a lot of other things, it created the conditions for this exact electoral makeup.
Outcome. Sierra, thoughts?
Yeah. I think anyone who knows me is not going to be surprised by what I have to say by this. I think that this is the sort of natural result of late stage capitalism. People are broke, y'all. People don't have no money. They want some money. They need some money. And I think what's like true historically in our nation is that in times when people are broke, they vote for Republicans. They vote for the conservative party. They believe that that is the party that is going to put more money into their pockets, even though that's like in the long run, like not actually true in how economics work. And we can blame that on the erosion of civic education and folks not understanding how markets work and how the economy works. But so to me, that's not surprising that demographics of people who have either always felt entitled to money and that they deserve money would vote for Donald Trump. And people who are also being sold an American dream that we know is not actual reality, that if you come here and you work hard, you will get money, then turn around and vote for this person for president. And I don't think in any stretch of the imagination, does it make sense for somebody who wants money to believe that this Black woman Democrat is going to be the person who puts that money into their pocket. So I think, yes, it is racism. Yes, it is sexism. And it's also the very real reality that people are very broke.
Was that something that you saw, because I know that you weren't at Scalawag at the time, but covering the South, was that something that really resonated with the kind of that geographic area?
Yeah, I think as a organizer and someone doing movement work in the South and really thinking about and understanding the very real material conditions that people are up against and facing right now, and also just understanding people's behavior and what they do, and also the narratives that permeate that lead folks to make the decisions that they do. Yeah, I do think all of those things together is sort of what leads me to be here. But I also think, to Lauren's point, maybe it is a little early to make sort of sweeping generalizations about what happened, but I do think people were very vocal about the fact that they need money. I think we also saw a lot of people be vocal about the fact that they feel like they had more money when Donald Trump was last in office than they did when Joe Biden was in office. And again, that goes back to how does the economy work? It is a cyclical thing. This was not Joe Biden's economy, et cetera, et cetera. But when people don't know that and they're listening to certain news stations that are feeding them certain narratives about whose fault it is that they don't have any money, again, I don't think it is surprising that this is where we landed.
JQ?
I think both Lauren and Sierra hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think it's going to be a while before we have the conversation about. There were lots of factors, I think, in why Harris lost, and sexism and racism are definitely factors that play into that. We saw during the election that even she didn't want to talk about identity, and I think because of that reason, we may never be able to have a really satisfying conversation about it. It's interesting. In the days after the election, I found myself scratching my head thinking oh, this is not how I thought it was going to play out demographically as far as the polling went. And I ended up having a conversation with a friend of mine who is a union organizer based in Baltimore. And when I just brought up these questions, I don't understand, I didn't think it would go this way. The breakdown, et cetera. And he said, I can tell you do not interact with poor people on a regular basis. And I gotta admit, he tugged my wig a little bit with that one. I'm you may be onto something. Because it's this idea, I don't think, people voted for Trump because of Trump. I think he just represented change, He was saying, I'm totally different from Biden. You don't like what's going on. I am not the same thing. And I think for a lot of people, especially, if they're not necessarily as media savvy, as clued in, if they are too busy working and trying to make ends meet to, take the time to read the article, let alone, pay to get past the paywall, the question isn't how are things going to change? What's the best change for me? It's just I need something different. I will do whatever. And we've seen that not just here, but in democracies across the globe. I think, most countries that have had elections where we had a record amount of elections last year, most of them did not go with the incumbent party. I think a major factor was the fact that she is a Democrat. She wasn't necessarily willing to distance herself from Biden and maybe carve out that space. And, we can do all the Monday morning quarterbacking in the world. That could probably be a totally different panel. But yeah, I think for those of us that are making media, making news, I think that we are not necessarily as keyed in with our audience or the audience that we want. Our audience isn't our audience. They're not paying attention. And I think that is a major factor. And the onus is a little bit on us for that.
I hate to ring the protect local or grow local news, fund local news bell, but I think something that you said is a huge part of it. I mean, I think we do a lot of reporting in rural Black communities, and we cover Black people, and our audiences are Black, so that's my framework. I'm not talking about the entire electorate here, but I think something that we find particularly in rural communities where there's less news or there's news deserts is just a sense of what's gonna help me tomorrow. And why am I struggling today? And I think when there are, overwhelmingly Black people vote Democrat, and they still did, but I think the shifts had to do with, one, people don't have that much information about the election, about policies. We would talk. I still don't know who she is. I still don't know her policies. She doesn't have any policies. We heard that a lot. And we also heard, I don't even hardly know who these people are, but the hospital down here closed, or it takes me an hour and a half to get to work, and all of these other issues that they don't feel are currently being addressed. And there's not enough information to help folks make decisions about what's next. And so change is change.
I think, so I totally agree it's multifactorial. There's a lot of things it's going to be unpacked. But I'm going with racism and sexism. And seriously, I am. I'm going with that as a significant element in what happened. You look at Barack Obama, a man who won twice, which, the conditions were different. You look at Hillary Clinton, who won the popular vote, but, lost the Electoral College. You have now the timing for Kamala. She had 3 months, that was definitely.
That was racist.
I'm just
put in these positions
right.
and have no time.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
It's the glass ceiling. Everything goes to crap. You put a woman of color at the top, and then when things continue to go to crap, you don't give her the resources. No.
Well, she did raise a ton of money. Her campaign raised a lot of money in a short period of time. But I just think that, I am president of this Black Talk radio station, WURD, in Philadelphia, and we are engaging with our communities. And I would hear Black men say, I just don't like the way she laughs. There's this discomfort around the gender thing for sure among a lot of men. And I think that we don't take sexism as serious, especially in the Black community, as we should, because I believe that it is much more, front and center than we acknowledge. And Black women have historically chosen race over gender issues because the movement required that. But anyway, I'm going with racism. I'm sorry.
When the election is as close as it was, when literally a handful of votes make the difference, I think it's easier to say that could, many different small factors in various communities could make the difference. But like, yeah, not that many people even have to be
Right.
racist or sexist for the entire thing to shift,
Yeah.
or to have a different opinion about Kamala Harris's capabilities.
Yeah, and I think there was a big miscalculation that reproductive justice and reproductive rights would resonate with white women voters a lot more than it did. Or maybe it resonated, but they sure didn't vote in the numbers that they could have around that particular issue. So we'll move on. We'll move on. And this, I'm going to start with you, Lauren, for this one, because I was reading some background information about Capital B, and you reference that Capital B is following in the tradition of the Black press that was started in 1827 with the first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. And obviously that was a time when, the Black press was advocating for the humanity of enslaved African women, men, and children. So I'm wondering, and what I realized is like the Freedom's Journal and the North Star, which was Frederick Douglass's, those newspapers only lasted for maybe like a year.
Yeah, they were really
I mean, they were the first and they did great work, but they were not sustainable. So I'm one, and this is really something for everyone. What is needed now to build and sustain a vibrant Black press today?
Money
Dollar bills?
is a big one, but I also, audience. I mean, I think that and they're connected, right? But like the ability to reach people with important information has drastically and dramatically changed over the last 5 years. And it is continuing to change dramatically and drastically. And, you can do everything you need to do to create news that's important, that's relevant, and it just needs to get to people. And the combination of, being able to have the resources to do the amount of work and the body of work that is needed, the expensive reporting that's needed to create impact and change, you can't do it on a shoestring. You just can't. And
Which is how most Black media
Yes.
has operated forever.
yes,
It's
I mean,
like
it's, and
on
it's
a
the idea
shoestring.
that that should be enough.
Right.
And when we, came up with the idea for Capital B, we came up with the network model, where we have a hub and different newsrooms, because we wanted to figure out a way to centrally resource a growing number of newsrooms and serve the most people that we could throughout the country. But it's not just about, it's not a problem that's only facing the Black press.
Yeah.
It's a general press problem, but we have to figure out a way to fund this important work that I believe is essential to healthy communities, to civically engaged communities, and it's a lot. It's going to require a lot. It's
Yeah.
going to require a lot.
Absolutely, and the revenue streams are changing, and they're dwindling in a lot of ways, which is a big part of why we started URL, was to really try and figure out how we could better resource Black and brown media organizations that are doing amazing work, that are serving communities, but don't have necessarily the infrastructure or the revenues or the amplification to get the visibility. But I wanted to just Sierra and JQ, any thoughts? I know you're with mainstream media, but you're a Black journalist.
Yeah,
So
that never stops.
So yeah, do you want to weigh in? Like what needs to happen to? And I'll reframe it a little bit for you. Like what needs to happen to make sure that Black voices are centered, are strengthened, especially in this moment when we know there's all of these rollbacks, and it's going to be rolling way back after Monday.
Not Walmart.
I mean, like way back. So, like, what do we need to do to support these voices and this work?
I mean, that's the literally multi-million dollar question. I think for those of us that are in the room, trying to stay there and trying to get our stories told as much as possible, and that can be a challenge. And sometimes you have to go through the back door about it, like through the cracks. At the end of the day, I wanted to tell a story about this Black girl in DC, in the district, not in Washington, because I think when people talk about DC, they're often talking about Washington. They're thinking Congress, the White House, all of those things. But, people live and work and build lives here. I am one of them. Like, we are an actual city full of actual people. And I think, when you talk about the policies that impact us most, that can often be a backdoor to tell those Black stories. That's at least what I try to do with my work. Because, it really is wild. You'll start researching a story, and then you find, wow, this exists because of some racism that happened a very long time ago. Like, everything just sort of goes back to this place. And I don't know, it's just like, if you're in the room, fight to tell those stories. But it's hard, especially with the state of the industry now, like even, having a job. So I think for those of us that are in those rooms, try to tell those stories as often as possible. If you're in the position where you're an editor, where you're the person making the calls, thinking, okay, how can I assign these stories? How can I make sure these stories get highlighted? And I'm not gonna pretend, it can be difficult at times.
Sierra, what are you thinking about this one?
God, let me get in my newsroom sustainability soapbox real quick. No, I have so many thoughts. I think one, the legacy Black press is still alive and very active. It would be, no, I think it would be easy to move millions of dollars to them. Yeah, philanthropy, hello. But then we make up all these rules about we can only move money to nonprofits, and there's an issue that these organizations are for profits, even though we understand the importance of building Black wealth. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense to me, even though they've been doing community engagement work well before all these other white-led newsrooms decided to do community engagement work. Seems odd.
100 years.
100 years. Have you kept a business alive for 100 years? Maybe 10. I don't know. Very strange behavior. I also think, being able to reach audiences and what it takes to actually grow an audience in this digital age is immense. It takes a ton of resources. You need a whole social media team to be able to even raise awareness and bring people in at the top of the funnel. You also have to understand SEO and how to optimize for search. And then you have to bring people to your site, and your site has to be optimized. And then you have to have a newsletter and multiple newsletters because you have to reach segmented audiences and on and on and on. And they want you to do that for $250,000. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. So it's just we're asking folks to do things that don't even make sense with the amount of money that doesn't even make sense for what is actually required to have the sort of impact that we want them to have. Philanthropy is a really big part of this, but also bringing in revenue from individuals, from our readers. That's something that's actually very new within news and within journalism because of advertising. So also remembering that we are in a transition period as well, where folks are having to shift from thinking about how do I get money from advertising to actually my audience matters not only because I need to reach them, but also I need them to give me some money. And so that's a new practice. And so I think, again, it's a confluence of factors always, but philanthropy could help a lot if they came up off those endowments.
Well, I also think that there are any number of successful models out there, not just in Black media, but everywhere. But you have to take into consideration what may or may not be successful if you're serving underserved communities or under-resourced communities. One of them is reader revenue. And I think that is, oftentimes we're talking to potential supporters or funders, and it's just like, well, I saw so much success with this other news organization. They make $2 million a year off of subscriptions, but they have a paywall, and it's like, well, we don't want to have a paywall. I mean, we want people to be able to access this information, and they won't if we have a paywall. And so there are different considerations to bringing more news to Black communities, and also sustaining what's been there for 100 years that I think isn't always understood.
Yeah.
And I think in mainstream media is something that is a big potential. I mean, I think there's something, I was talked about 2020 when Capital B was started, or we came up with the idea of Capital B. That was such a different time. It brought on a lot of change in newsrooms and in the thinking that funders had about what to fund, but that has all fizzled. And, a concern of mine, particularly for Black journalists who are in mainstream newsrooms, is that all that stuff that changed or that, evolved after 2020 this moment is free reign to get rid of all of it and go back to the way things used to be. It's happening in corporate America, and mainstream news is corporate America.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that that's a real potential challenge for Black journalists across the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been a Black media entrepreneur my entire life, my entire career, and it has been a nonstop struggle. And one thing that I will say, and I don't know whether it's gendered or racialized or whatever, but I know that we come from a tradition where you can make $1 out of 15 cents.
That's it.
And we get penalized for it. We get penalized for it because it becomes normalized, and the expectation is that you don't need, one, you don't deserve more, and two, you probably don't need it because you're figuring out how to survive. And so I would love to see, and I agree, the landscape is it's changing. But the thing that I also know is that, everybody's talking about, oh, local news, it's dying. And well, our stuff has been struggling forever. We know how to manage scarcity. We know how to continue to thrive amidst uncertainty and scarcity. But I would love to see, in this moment when we know that Black communities, brown communities are going to need our work more than ever, that there really is a renewed commitment.
Feels like a good time for reparations. Feels like a great day for reparations.
Well, speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, asking people who have been systematically ignored and undervalued and underserved to turn around and pay for something is crazy. That's bananas, y'all. Folks are owed access to news and information because we understand that news and information is power, and they have been kept away from that. So we shouldn't be really thinking about where is our ROI for communities of color anytime soon. We have a lot of work to do, a lot of apologizing to do, a lot of ownership to take, and a lot of money to move before that's true.
So I want to go back to this this question or this quote from Audre Lorde: "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." And this is for all of us, all of you. What are the new tools that we need, that will be needed for what's ahead? And none of us really know. We can only have nightmares about it. But what are the new tools? I'll start with you, JQ. What are some of the new tools you think we need?
I mean, are you thinking in terms of technology or skill?
Whatever, however you want to process it.
Ooh, oh my gosh. Wow. Okay, I think if I did have the answer, I would listen, I'd have a lot of money to give to a lot of black newsrooms right now. I know that for certain. Oh man, I think the first thing that pops up to mind is how are we going to navigate this AI situation? Information is moving so quickly. Disinformation and misinformation, I think, move even faster. And I think battling that is going to be the big challenge. I know people, and this is no shade, because I think, if they're there, that's where we need to be. But I know people who get their news off Instagram, who are like just scrolling through the comments like, oh, I saw it in, I don't know if you all, so I'm extremely online. I don't know if any of y'all, how online y'all are, but there's this video of Megan Thee Stallion where she's like, letters, big bold background. Don't believe everything with letters and big bold background, because there's something, I don't know what it is, you put a graphic online and it's in a certain font and people are like, I believed that to be true. And so we've seen lots of entities use those things in order to spread information. And I often think, okay, well, how do we counteract that, and what is our version of that? So I think I'm really looking at technology, but it's also just like, wait, maybe that's one of the master's tools, so that won't work. So yeah.
Go ahead,
I
Sierra.
don't have a problem with Instagram. If you get your news from Instagram, that's so great. And hey, I think that then it's incumbent on us to go where our audiences are and be on Instagram. And by being Instagram, for the newsmakers in the room, I don't mean post your latest story with a little picture to Instagram. That is not being on Instagram. That does not drive engagement. Your audiences are not going to build affinity for you. They're not going to become loyal supporters that then follow you off platform, which is what you need to get them to do to be able to get them to be actually in your audience. So it's like really thinking about audiences is, I think, and therefore thinking about people, which is a tool that I actually don't know that journalism has really employed historically, thinking about the actual people that they are talking to, and also having a theory of change. There are people, what do we want them to do? I think oftentimes it has been true that journalism has been like, we're just here to tell you the story, and then we're out, and you figure that out on your own. And then we're like, oh no, people voted for Donald Trump. Well, you didn't really help them do anything else. You just gave them some information. So we have to make an active decision to be able to be like, actually, because we believe in democracy, and we believe that this person is actually not for democracy, we believe that this person, I personally believe this person is a fascist. Therefore, we are saying, hey, like, we need to be doing more to make sure that folks are moving in a direction that's going to help us uphold democracy. And so I think that's another sort of tool that, I know it's antithetical to journalism and how we've done this thing, but that is going to be really important if we count ourselves as a part of a group of people, a system of change that is moving toward a more just and equitable world.
I think, I was just gonna say, I think the point about meeting audiences where they are is really important. I cannot tell you the amount of times I have talked to somebody and said, oh, I have a podcast, you should listen. And they're like, oh yeah, I'll look it up on YouTube. And I'm like, girl, that's not a podcatcher, what do you mean? But that's where a majority of people get their podcasts. That's where, there was a study not too long ago, but the majority of like Black and brown people are listening to their podcasts on YouTube. Mm-hmm. Like they are just, we have to really start engaging, not with where we want our audience to be, which is, our websites, our podcatchers, et cetera, but meeting them, okay, where are you actually? And can I get you to follow me from there? Because the answer actually may be no. It could be that we just need to camp out in these new spaces.
Yeah, and understanding that there's different people on the different things. A story from early Vox actually is Ezra Klein is founder of Vox. At the same time, Vox's YouTube channel was exploding. And at one point, Ezra posted on his Twitter, which had like 2 million followers or something, that one of Vox's YouTube videos. And a fan on YouTube reached out to our head of video and was like, I just want you to know Ezra Klein's stealing your YouTube videos. And because because the YouTube fans had just nothing to do with that like policy wonk situation happening on Twitter,
That's it.
and had no idea that it was even the same box. And I think that's like a dramatic example, but thinking about who we're reaching in all of these different places is really important. I think for the way that Capital B is thinking about it, obviously meeting people where they are, but not investing too much into any one thing because it's changing rapidly, and like it's going to be different in 6 months. And what we are really focusing on over the next few years is an algorithm-proof audience. I think at this point we can very much say that the master's tools are social media platforms, and quite literally. And while our audience uses those things, and so we're going to use them too, but we have to find a way that we're going to be building in-person relationships with people on the ground, such that if Instagram changes its algorithm and the audience that we were reaching so well no longer even sees our content, that it is okay, because we have connected with people in person and we have forged these relationships with people in person, and Instagram was a bonus. And I also think that like there are tools that we can still use and flip. I mean, I think that's what you were saying about Instagram, but I also think it's like ways of thinking to connect with what you were saying about funding on a shoestring. I think it's ways to think about, how audacious I think, white, executives or nonprofit executives, because that's what I think about, are, and how much money they ask for. and what they say they need. When I first started out, we had a goal for how much money we needed to raise to launch Capital B. And I talked to someone, a white man who was very successful in the nonprofit news industry, and he was like, "Oh, you need like 4 times that."
Yeah.
And he was like, "And you need to ask for it." And I was like, "What do you mean? How are we going to go? We don't have any, like, this is the most that we're going to raise." And he was like, "No, ask for it."
And timing is everything.
Oh, our timing was
Your
really
timing
good
was
for that.
perfect.
But I think it really, our natural instinct, I think as Black women, but also as people who've been really beaten down by the industry year after year after year, was to
Lowball.
think as ambitiously as possible about what we wanted to do,
For the least amount of
but think about the smallest amount of money that could get us there.
Yep.
And that was 100% our mindset going in. And that flipped our mindset of no, we actually need all of this to do this. And there's just a mindset that we have going into things, I think, that is the opposite of that.
Yeah, that's great. One of the reasons I really love working so closely with Mitra is that our careers are so different. She comes from the biggest of the big, CNN, these big media organizations. I came from independent Black media, and I think we balance each other out really well, where she's like, go for the moon, and I'm like, okay, let's.
Where's the ground?
Yeah, where's the ground? Let's. But one of the things I just want to weigh in terms of new tools. This isn't really a new tool, but it is a philosophy that I feel very strongly about, that we embody at WURD, my radio station, we embody at URL, is that we have to spend our money with organizations that value our communities and our work, and I, you talked about capitalism and being in a capitalistic society. We are very intentional about, one of the reasons we are streaming on Spill and not on Instagram is because Spill is a Black-owned social media platform. We have to, I think, in this new environment, be very judicious and very intentional about where and how we spend our money, because it matters, and it's going to, I think, reverberate in a lot of different ways. So I just I feel really, really strongly about that. I think it's almost time to go to questions. We are going to do questions. I'm not sure where the mics are, but
Perfect.
yeah, Elliot, I think there's a question, an arm raised.
Hi.
Can you say your name? I'm from Talk Radio. You got to say your name.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Barbara Simmons from Philadelphia,
Oh, Barbara Simmons, all right. Philly in the house.
North Philadelphia, in fact. I'm chair of the International Law Section of the National Bar Association. And Justice, I'd like to ask, how many people in this room know that Africa has created its own version of the World Trade Organization? 3 people. The AFCFTA is a game changer. And we met with the Secretary General on Monday. He is committed to having African Americans involved in that process, and they want us to help get the word out. And what better than the black media to do that? So I'm proposing that we work together for that, because he is being approached by all over the world, but he said he's committed to having us involved. So we have to step up with a strategic plan, though. So I'm looking forward to us working on that. I must say that back in March, the NBA met with White House staff and said, you're not getting the message out, that you need to involve black media. And I think at one point, Sarah, I even said that to you, that we were pushing for that. We didn't see, I got 8 pieces of literature from the Trump campaign before I got 1 from the Democratic Party. When President Biden came to Philadelphia and had a event at Girard College afterward, he met with some of us. I personally said to him at that time, black media needs to be involved in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
But I think that the only reason I'm not depressed, in fact, I'm excited, is because we've got to go global.
I agree.
And so with this AFCFTA, the sky's the limit, and they're waiting for us, and we need you to get that word out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that was a real pain point. And because WURD is in Philadelphia, it's in Pennsylvania, it was a major swing state, we actually did get advertising, political advertising, a lot actually from the Harris-Walz campaign. But I know a lot of Black and brown media organizations were kind of iced out. And I know when I tried to solicit for URL on behalf of URL, we got nowhere. And so I do think that there was a real kind of mismatch and a missed opportunity for them to have been more intentional. I don't know if any of you all, Lauren,
Oh, I mean, I think it was very clear what their strategy was
digital.
in a short amount of time, go to the podcasters. But I, obviously we tried, and every other Black-led news organization I know that tried, got shut down.
nowhere.
Yeah.
Whew. Well, that's one of the things they need to revisit. Other questions? Yes. Can you say your name?
Dion Rabowen, from a new venture called The Black Press. I've heard of, I think each of you kind of mentioned the state of journalism or the state of the news industry. And I think because you all come from such different backgrounds, or you're representing such different organizations, I'd be interested to hear from each of you, what is the current state of the media?
Current state of media?
Media, journalism, the industry.
Ooh.
Oh my God.
Like,
I would say it's absolutely essential. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential and is getting more critical all the time. But I think the business models are
when we talk about
broken.
the state of it, that's, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the struggle of the business. Of
Yeah, the business
journalism.
models are really fractured and broken and need to be reinvented.
Yeah, and I think that there's energy in the nonprofit space. There's energy around figuring out the solutions. I think in the commercial space, it is much more bleak. because we're getting to a point on the news, on the print side, where there's like one newspaper that's financially successful and a couple of others that, you know, are managing, and then everything else seems like just an enormous struggle. And I think, you know, the same is true on the digital side. And so there's major questions to grapple with over the next 4 years about what is going to happen to, you know, the institutions, the major institutions, press institutions in our country. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in smaller, more experimental corners, but I think the big dogs are in trouble.
Yeah.
Giving media bailout.
Well, I mean, there's also.
Although I don't think that's going to happen under this
I
administration.
mean, I think the philanthropic world is, to me, seems like the only sector that's kind of trying to step up in a big way. Press Forward being this, you know, collaborative initiative with multiple journalism philanthropies to try and put $500 million of funding into local and media journalism in general. I do think government, there are some glimmers of hope in terms of like New York City, California. There's certain states that are looking at ways to fund community media through government, you know, government subsidies, and also like kind of prioritizing Black and Brown community media for ad spends. So, you know, but I think that it's kind of bleak right this second.
Yes. And I think there's a ton of uncertainty going into, you know, the next 4 years and what.
When the media is like public enemy number one.
Right. Or even worse, if you know, if the, you know, billionaire class behind some of the most influential news organizations don't want to be public enemy number one like they were last time, and what they'll do to not make that happen.
Does anybody else want to answer that question, or do we have other? Yeah, we have a bunch of questions. Wow. Okay.
Hi, I'm Kavita. It's so great to see so many of you, people that I admire. I direct the Asian Media Initiative at CUNY's Journalism School. We support community-based journalism for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders alongside the Black and Latino media initiatives. And I think the elephant in the room that I keep thinking about that we did not talk about in this conversation is xenophobia. And one thing that we look at the history of Black and Brown media and AAPI media and queer media is that it was historically quite transnational and quite global, not only in scope, but in terms of community engagement and in audiences that were engaged. And that was actively dismantled by the US government. Speaking of MLK, we know his experience of being actively treated as an enemy of the state. And we saw that across the board. I'm wondering now, going forward, what your thoughts are about how we can address democracy in transnational contexts, where we have diasporic communities. In New York right now, 25% of the Black community is immigrant, right? And we know that that's the case for all of our communities, Black and Brown communities. Our communities need information about what's happening in countries of origin, and these narratives, these xenophobic narratives, the oldest narratives in the world is that immigrants are to blame for your problems. That narrative has been pushed forward across the board in transnational spaces. I have a colleague who has been doing some research using our directory of AAPI media, and he's looking at the capacity of local in-language independent newsrooms to set a news agenda in the face of the enormous amount of work and pressure that's coming from state media and privately funded disinformation campaigns, and they just do not stand a chance. So when you talk about engaging in digital spaces, obviously very important to point out that there are places like Spill, but how can we push back against these transnational convergence fascist efforts, basically to demonize the most vulnerable at a time when we know with growing climate change that the majority of the world will be immigrant soon?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love this question as a Southerner. I think that something that being from the South has taught me is that our struggles are tied together, and that so much of the really repressive and harmful things that we see happening in the South, which is, you know, the part of the country with the most Black people, are also being practiced across the globe. And so, you know, there is an ongoing genocide in Palestine, and being able to understand that the same training that the cops in Atlanta are getting is the same training that is happening in Palestine with the military. That is who taught them what they are doing in Atlanta. And so being able to tell narratives and stories like that help folks understand that this is a larger global epidemic. And it is not just something that is happening to us in this country. We are so US centric. We are so focused on ourselves, but that we need to be practicing solidarity. And what are those solidarity narratives that we should be telling and sharing? And how does that converge with the things that we've been talking about around audience reach, and being able to get those stories out there in ways that have not been, you know, the narrative for the right is so easy. Hate. The narrative for us is more complicated. Love. People have a hard enough time loving themselves. How do we teach them to love other people that they do not know who are very different from them? And yeah, so what does that look like? What do those narratives look like? I know that's something that y'all think about a lot at URL and other organizations, but like, I think that's sort of at the heart of that. And how do we move that have that not just be a theory, but an actual practice, which I think is where the gap is right now.
Other questions? Yes.
Sonia Ross, Black Women Unmuted.
Oh, hi, Sonia.
Hi. A quick question for the whole panel here. Could you give me your assessment on how good a job or bad a job our industry did of meeting its specific fourth estate obligation where undergirding democracy is concerned with the coverage of this 2024 election? And maybe we want to dial it back to 2020, fine, but how well a job did we do of meeting what we are supposed to be doing in reporting what's going on in the actions of the governors that affect the lives of the governed?
Who wants to take a stab at that? How good of a job did we do in this election to hold, I guess, the powerful to account and to really be that kind of arbiter of truth?
I think it's hard to give like a holistic answer to that question, because I think that even within the same news organization, there can be just like wildly different ways that people have performed. But I also think that there are a lot of ways this election that I think I saw news organizations trying to be better. But this is happening at the same time, and I keep going back to this, but at the same time where the distribution methods and the levers for sharing that information, we're actively suppressing it and amplifying things that weren't true. So I think those incremental improvements that were made, I don't matter, because I don't think people could see it or find it or read it.
I think we improved quite a bit, especially I think compared to 2016. That being said, trust was lost then. Trust was lost before then. And if you're doing a better job, sometimes it doesn't matter if people don't trust you to begin with.
Yeah, I kind of disagree. I don't think we did such a, I mean, not we. I think that I did a great job.
You did a great job.
No, but I'm just thinking about, I'm thinking about mainstream media that does have a lot of resources, that does have a lot of influence. And I personally feel like there was a lot of validating of Donald Trump. There was a lot of normalizing his crazy. And I think that that was problematic. You know, he was never someone that you could cover like the both siderism and the, you know, I thought we learned that from his first, you know, presidency. And I just felt like there was, and maybe it's like, it's a, you know, like it's an unwinnable situation because, you know, you're trying to be balanced and fair and all of those things, which you're trying to, you know, that is a baseline tenet of journalism. And if we go back to the NABJ kerfuffle,
Oh my God.
where, you know, a lot of people were like, he should not have even been invited
Nowhere
because he's a fascist, because he's, you know, like not a credible candidate.
near. A reliable narrator.
And so, but there was a lot of like controversy around that. And so like, you know, like I think he is like a real, you know, he is a complicated figure because he lies, you know, I mean, like he's just not even trying to be, you know.
And our response to that is like to fact check him.
Right. So I personally think that there were some flaws in the way that the general approach to him and his behavior was normalized and kind of co-signed in some ways.
I think as I move to the next question, I'll quickly say like, I think so something that we did at Scalawag is really think about when we are talking about covering power, what kind of power are we reporting on? And I don't think that as journalists, we do enough to cover the power of communities and power of movements. And so, yeah, when you continue to just cover politicians, to just cover folks who have all the power and have always had all the power, there will be a certain narrative around power that people believe. But when you actually start to cover people power and report on people power, people will start believing in themselves and in their ability to build movements and build together. And so I think that is something that we have a lot more work to do around. There are people in your community right now who are doing extraordinary, incredible things, who are bringing people together to create and affect change, and no one is talking about the work that they're doing.
I think we have time for maybe like one or two more questions. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Madeleine Gosica, a recovering journalist.
Freedom.
I'm now a nonfiction book editor, and I could tell you all sorts of parallels between publishing and the media, news media. I'm really interested in this question of reaching people with, you know, all these amazing efforts that are being done locally across the country. I saw what I thought was a brilliant description of how the public consumes news media today, that they bump into it as part of their daily lives. Either they'll bump into it because they put the car on and there was news at the top of the hour, or they're in a family WhatsApp group and somebody sends a story that way. They're not actively, oh, it's 6 o'clock, I gotta watch the local news. You know, I've gotta subscribe to my local paper. How do we deal with that problem? Because I think one of the other challenges of the presidential, and I'm with Sara, racism and misogyny, the presidential happens in a vacuum of what was happening in your state for the last 4 years, right? You know, your congressman did not vote for...
your city.
Yeah, or your congressman did not vote for the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill or support, you know, caps on Medicare prescription. Like, it is a complete and utter vacuum. And the resources that mainstream media, and as a graduate of about as mainstream as you can get, ABC News, NPR, Washington Post, it's asymmetric, right? It's asymmetric how much we focus on the presidential versus something else. So I would love to know how you address this issue of, yes, we need to meet people where they are, but are they going to respond to us? And there's a second part to this that me.
Hi, I'm so sorry we're cheating. I know.
That last night, too.
I did. Hey, everyone. I'm Mitra Khalida, the co-founder of URL Media. My question is so simple. Black women, how do you feel about brown women right now? And how do you feel about white women right now?
Is this directed at me?
Wow.
And, and,
Oh my God.
I don't know,
if you can't talk about how you feel,
I see Mitra in here.
No, I think it's, I think
we're
it's
live streaming, so I gotta make sure that we're behaving.
we'll be
If you
very
can't talk about how you're
chill.
feeling, how will you cover that sentiment? And I can dive into what I mean by that, but I think you all know post-election.
So it's two
questions.
Two questions.
Yeah.
How do black women feel about brown women? And the other question is like, how do you engage audience? Like, how do you get to audience? How do you get them to respond? How do you?
How do we reach them when they're not in a state to, they're not consuming news? And
Yeah.
our competition is not just other news, it's Netflix, it's 3 jobs.
It's the whole internet.
Yeah.
We need to connect with more. I mean, I think something that this, this moment requires is that we need to connect with more trusted messengers and communities. I think we need to help create more journalists, but even if they're not like capital J journalists, we need to connect with the people who disseminate, because there's always someone who disseminates information in communities. Everyone wants to say it's the barbershop always, but there's so many different places, there's so many different kinds of people who are information gatherers and information givers. And I think we as journalists need to get off of our high horse about like what a journalist is or isn't, and start to work with people in communities to partner to do the work of information disseminating together.
Go ahead, JQ.
I was going to say, I also think it's this idea, it's like, okay, people are bumping into news. So we need to be in the places where they're bumping into news. And I think part of that starts with having a natural curiosity about the people in your life who aren't necessarily, maybe don't come from the same socioeconomic background, or work background, or education background. And just, asking a few questions like, oh, like, where'd you find that? Or like, oh, what did you look at today? And I think maybe for a lot of people, they don't have those people in their lives. And I think maybe it's, if so, maybe look internally and be like, wow, why are all of the people in my life exactly the same? Like maybe I should work to be in community with the people who I want to actually read and listen and watch my work.
I'm going to put
ahead,
on
Sierra.
my coach and consulting hat on here and just say, market yourselves, have a brand. I think most newsrooms, their brand is like generic, local, high quality journalism. We report the news and they think that folks like care about that. And that's not true anymore because we are competing with the whole internet. So what is your brand? How do you stand out? How are people building affinity so that they choose you over this other thing over here? And do you have an advertising budget? Are you advertising yourself? When I went to the airport in Atlanta and I saw that the New York Times was advertising with like Questlove, I was like, dang, that makes me want to subscribe to the New York Times. And I'm not saying you have to do that because everybody ain't got a New York Times budget, but there are things that you can do to actually like market your newsroom with a brand that's going to resonate with people that would invite them into your audience. Mitra, I think to your question, another reason I love being a Southerner is because I think we understand the complex and nuanced ways of being of different people. And so I think it's really easy to say like, this is white women's fault. Like, I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that. Or like, this is not anybody else's fault. I think it's thinking about what is like very true for people and how they are and who they are. I think if we take white women in particular, they are also subject to the same sexist systems that we are. White women's survival has long been predicated on their ability to stay in the good graces of the men in their lives. And so when that is the case, even if you might personally feel a particular way, if the way that you have been raised is that your survival is dependent on this man, and this man says that we are doing this thing, you are more likely to do that thing because that is a part of your survival, but it's also a part of how you understand the world. And to think that we have done the work to help people understand the world in a different way, in a way that makes them more free personally, so that they can make collective decisions that support all of us, we haven't done that work. So then we can't be surprised that even when it goes against their own rights, that or their own way of being, that people vote that the way that they do, or they do the things that they do. So I think that's really at the core of all of this, is like really thinking about, no, what do people believe about themselves and about what's true and what's possible, and helping them to be able to radically imagine something different.
And I would say to your question, Mitra, and we have these conversations a lot, you know, I think that the anti-Black sentiments, anti-Black racism is something that's like in the air. It's like it is exported out of America. It is, you know, like reinforced in America. You know, you have people from Nigeria or Ghana who look at Black Americans as like less than, or, you know, because the images, and that's why our work is so important, the images and the stereotypes that are exported and reinforced are oftentimes very negative. And so it is not surprising to me that other people, non-white people, have anti-Black racist leanings or tendencies, predispositions. So I think that we have to have very real and honest conversations. We, you know, like BIPOC, I know BIPOC is out of favor right now, but, you know, like and with URL, we were very intentional about being multicultural, multiracial, multi-platform, because we believe that if we can have authentic coalitions, the you know, main word there, authentic coalitions, we can be so much more powerful.
That's right.
Black people are 13% of the United States. Alone, we're never going to have the critical mass to, I mean, we have the cultural influence, we have a lot of influence, but we don't have the numbers. But if we're able to create coalitions that are predicated on respect and, you know, love, all of those things, then we have a shot at changing the dynamics in this country, and definitely globally. We, you know, black and brown people are the majority globally. So I think, and one of the reasons that you and I are business partners is because you have been very clear that this is, URL was going to be Black-centered, even as we are multicultural and multi-racial. And that, to me, is an acknowledgement of the unique experience of Black Americans in this country that is, that cannot be easily explained or easily, you know, like it can't be put under the rug, which it's about to go under the rug. You know, the people, the Trump administration is going to put it under the rug. But we have to assert who we are, and I believe that we need to coalition build with everyone who is like-minded and believes in solidarity, believes in racial justice and equality. So I'm getting the wrap-up sign. So I want to, we were supposed to end on like a really hopeful note.
That was it.
I'm just that is hopeful.
That is hopeful.
One last thing, I'm sorry, you guys, but how can we support each person's work up here? Because we're trying to build a community here. And so, JQ, how can people support your work?
Yeah, pull out your phone right now, open up your podcatcher of choice, and type in "explain it to me," and hit subscribe and or follow. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your enemies. I don't know, they deserve good podcasts too. And if you would like to ask a question where I give you a call and find out why you're asking the question, talk to some experts, and get you an answer, you can call 1-800-618-8545. That's 1-800-618-8545.
All right.
And I will hear you in podcast land.
Excellent. Lauren, how can people
Phones
support
are
you?
still out. You can go to capitalbnews.org and sign up for our newsletter and get Capital B in your inbox and learn what we're about. And maybe one day you'll want to support us.
Sierra?
I don't need personal support right now, praise God, because, I'm also a recovering publisher. So that's wonderful. And I think the best thing that you can do is support these women in their work, but also support Black media organizations that are fighting really, really hard to survive and sustain themselves.
And I would say download the Word Radio app. You can just go in the App Store, WURD
Come on,
Radio,
Fox.
and it's it's a free app. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter at Word. You can also go to url-media.com and subscribe to the URL Media suite of newsletters, and go to our website, which has an aggregation of some of the best multicultural media and news around Scalawag and Capital B and Word and lots of people who are in here, their work as well. So we are out of time. We're going to take a little break. Dishes are going to be cleared. And then next up is going to be a fabulous conversation with Mitra Khalida, Kenya Parham, and Don Lemon. So don't go away.